Sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Tune in for our first ever podcast presidential debate. For our next episode, 2 teams of Buckley Fellows will make their pitches for who should be the next president of the United States, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. The event will be streamed live on Monday, October 21st at 4:30 p.m. on the Buckley Institute YouTube channel, then shared as a podcast. Tune in to hear one last pitch for Trump or Harris before you cast your ballot. Tickets are now on sale for our 14th annual conference on November 8th, featuring keynote speaker Vivek Ramaswamy. Join Buckley for a full day honoring the 50th anniversary of the Woodward Report, Yale's free speech principles, including speakers from the Yale administration, the original signers of the Woodward Report, and even a debate on the limits of free speech. Get your tickets or sponsor at buckleyinstitute.com/conference. Again, buckleyinstitute.com/conference. See you guys there. Welcome everyone to Pod and Man at Yale. As always, I'm Ari Schaefer, Communications Director here at the Buckley Institute. Today, I'm happy to have returning to the podcast Arav Dalwani, a junior.
Hi, happy to be here.
And new to the podcast, John Matthews-Ederington, a sophomore.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Today, we're going to be looking at foreign policy. Usually our past episodes have had a Yale focus, but this week we're just going to let a few Yale undergrads analyze the world, a world that seems to be on the brink of chaos. The obvious hot topic is the Israel-Hamas conflict. It's dominated the news since Hamas's October 7th terror attacks last year spawned protests around the world, including on Yale's own campus. So let's start with the end and work our way back. How do you guys think this conflict ends? What do you think it'll take to end the current bout of fighting between Israel and Hamas in Gaza? Arav, you want to start us off?
The current conflict between Hamas and Israel has been quite ugly. I think all of us at Yale can also attest to that, given the protests that have happened over the past few months. But ultimately, I think the only way this ends is with a ceasefire.
I think I disagree with you a little bit. I do think that Israel's probably likely to stay in Gaza for a little while. I think, maybe according to Israel's national interests, they wouldn't stay in Gaza. They would negotiate a ceasefire. They would, and reform the Palestinian Authority and ensure that it can govern, all of Palestine. But I don't think Netanyahu has in Israel's best interest in mind. I think probably this is going to be sort of a insurgency that simmers down a little bit, and then eventually we might see a more chaotic, sort of not very well brokered withdrawal.
Do you guys think this can end without intervention from some third power saying, okay, guys, time to end this? Do you think there's a point where Israel might say, okay, we've done what we need to do, we're done, or Hamas will say, okay, let's just end this now?
I think that Israel's already under pressure from a lot of its Arab neighbors to negotiate a deal. We know that we've been having a lot of these negotiations going on in Qatar. I think that Israel has the military power, economic power to sustain whatever foreign policy it wants with regards to Gaza. I don't think outside pressure can really shift it too much. So I think it will largely end when the Israeli government, maybe after the next elections, decides that it wants it to end.
So a big part of this is the hostages, 100 of whom who were kidnapped on October 7th are still being held by Hamas in Gaza. They're Hamas's last piece of leverage, so to speak, in this conflict. Do you think Hamas will let them go? What kind of price is Hamas going to demand from Israel to release the last remaining hostages?
I think for the hostage exchange in this situation, I'm not sure if Israel will be willing to give 400 of Hamas's prisoners back in exchange for 100 of theirs, and this is because I think they've had the experience before of releasing political prisoners or people that were legitimately terrorists that went on to bite them in the back, and I think they're going to be very cautious with that sort of exchange.
And so you just referenced this. Back in 2011, Israel traded 1,000 Palestinian prisoners for a captured Israeli soldier who had been in captivity for about 5 years. His name's Gilad Shalit. Among those 1,000 prisoners were the terrorists who ended up planning and executing the October 7th terrorist attack that started this all. So let's take a minute. You guys are, let's say, you're the prime minister of Israel. You're the leader of the country. You're looking at that history and going, the last time we made an exchange, this is how it ended. How do you think about making decisions like that if this could end the conflict but create more conflict in the future? John?
Hamas was very popular among the people of Gaza. I think they were going to be able to recruit enough individuals to make an attack. Whether they had the exact strategic leadership, it matters, but I think also a lot of the failure of October 7th was an intelligence failure on Israel's part. They didn't have the forces near the Gaza Strip. I believe they had their forces more near the West Bank.
I think if we are moving towards more of a ceasefire and a peace deal with in the conflict, then I would say it would make sense to conduct the hostage exchange, just because I think there's a lot of families that in my own country that would have been separated for so long, and I think it's only right to reunite them. As for the issue that maybe we're releasing some terrorists back into the Hamas leadership, and that's risky. I think what we would have to do is, like John said, step up our intelligence and step up our secret activities and undercover activities, and I think that's how we would have to compensate for that.
So a big part of the Israel-Gaza, West Bank Palestinian conflict is the idea of a two-state solution. It seems to be waning in recent years, but especially in the 90s, that early 2000s, that was the big discussion, was the two-state solution, Palestine, Israel. That was the original UN plan, back in the 40s. How realistic do you think a two-state solution is going forward in light of everything that's happened over the past year?
I think now it's much more unrealistic, and I think that's because of two reasons. One is obviously the conflict that's happened with Hamas, but the second thing is I think the Palestinian National Authority as a whole, including the leadership in the West Bank, is much more unlikely to accept a peace deal, just because I think of because of the environment, and I think the issue that they see Israel as having encroached in the West Bank already through settlements, illegal settlements that shouldn't be there, and I think that really complicates the issue.
I think right now the main issue is that we have the split between Hamas and Fatah in the West Bank. So we have, Palestinian Authority and Israel want to negotiate, but then there's this third party that makes it sort of hard dynamics to get them all three at a table. It makes it Hamas is going to pressure the Palestinian Authority when the Palestinian Authority is negotiating with Israel and force them to be more maximalist. So I think sort of getting just two sides is going to make it a lot easier, though.
So we could talk and debate about this for hours. People write entire books about this. But there are other things going on in the world, and we do want to focus on some of them. The other major flashpoint is Russia, Ukraine, the war going on there. It's fallen a bit under the radar because of the conflict in Israel. But the most recent developments for those who are watching the news is that Ukraine has started conducting strikes in Russian territory. Is that a smart move from Ukraine from a strategic standpoint?
I'm not entirely sure this is a good idea. I think right now Ukraine's military activities and operations in Russia have been limited in terms of how much territory they've taken, how many towns they've captured. If it escalates further than that, I think things could get quite out of hand, and Russia could even move towards a more general mobilization of the population for increasing the scale of the war.
Could I push back on the notion of a mobilization? I mean, I don't think Russia's invasion of Ukraine itself is a massive violation of international law. I don't think they're holding back from mobilization because of the potential for strikes in Russian territory. I mean, yes, They could send in, they would be allowed to conscript more Russians if there was an attack on more Russians would be willing to fight if Ukraine were fighting in Russia because they're allowed to conscript soldiers to defend the homeland. But I don't think I think Russia so far hasn't been mobilizing many forces to send to Kursk. And besides the missile strikes you can't respond with, conscripts to that. And it wouldn't legally allow Russia to send forces into Ukraine proper, even if their territory was under attack.
So to kind of, I guess, boil this down, let me know if I'm getting this right. Arav, you think this could get a lot worse if Ukraine tries to go more hard into Russia. John, you think Russia's given all they've got and we've seen the worst they can give.
If let's say Russia decides we're not going to mobilize the entire population, but we're just going to drop a nuke on a Ukrainian city. They do have that. You have to remember that they do have that sort of advantage, and the dynamic is still tilted in favor of Russia. They could just simply drop the nuke and do nothing else. So
how likely do we think that is? Right, the possibility of nuclear war has been a part of this discussion from the beginning. Do you guys think Russia could end up using nuclear weapons?
I mean, I think whenever you're talking about nuclear weapons, you should always say, yes, there is a possibility that's going to happen. We've never had a launch other than, during the Second World War. I think that's reason for itself that there's a low probability of it happening, but I mean, it's hard to predict.
Never say never, I guess. Yeah. How about you, Arav?
I don't think Russia intended to use nuclear weapons when they went in, just because of the fact that it would make them a pariah in the international community, and they would lose their own allies, even countries like China that sort of have a favorable relationship with Russia, China and India. But if it gets to the point where they're really provoked by what Ukraine is doing in their own territories, and Ukraine has taken a considerable amount in, let's say, the neighboring regions. I think they would be much more likely to consider dropping a nuclear weapon.
So, who comes out on top in this war, and what does coming out on top look like?
I think that Russia comes out on top no matter what. We're not going to be seeing Ukrainian forces, marching into Crimea. I don't think that we're definitely not going to see Ukraine putting significant pressure on Russia, I think Ukraine has been fighting a war of national survival. I think that it will be good enough for them if they survive, if they can keep a fair chunk of their territory. I think their best prospects is they can get out with a fair amount left and have the freedom in international diplomacy to negotiate accession to the European Union, to NATO. I think, there's still, though, a pretty big chance that they lose a significant amount, and they're, like Georgia, in a position where they can't, they're going to not be sufficiently threatened that they're not going to try anything in the future.
They keep asking, people on the right and GOP congressmen, do you want Ukraine to win? And I'm not sure that's the right way to look at it. I don't think there is a path for Ukraine to win in this, just because everything is tilted against them. And I think what would be in everyone's best interest is to find a way to broker a ceasefire, broker an end to the conflict where Ukraine gets the least bad outcome.
Let's move on to one of the other areas that, sometimes takes the headlines when, we have the attention span for it, and that's China. For years, people have talked about how China needs more attention. It became a major focus of the Trump administration's 4 years, but other, the hot conflicts have taken our media attention. Does China need more of U.S.'s attention? Arav?
I think they definitely do, and I think especially with the language that they've been coming out with regards to Taiwan, the way they've been talking about that in recent years. I also feel like China has been much more emboldened to sort of expand and sort of assert itself on the international stage after COVID has happened.
I think that the United States needs to pay more attention to foreign policy in general, but I think China has been a little bit overhyped relative to other issues. Like we saw during the Trump administration and the early Biden administration, this very big shift towards China, Quad, AUKUS, et cetera. And then we saw Russia blow up and Israel blow up because we weren't really managing everything else in the world. I think we really do. I think it's good to see a little bit of a refocus towards China, but I think that we should be cautious not to abandon our other responsibilities. So part of the discussion about China is the question about whether China is willing to live in a U.S. determined rules-based international order. And there is rhetoric coming out of China that, some of the people in China, leaders in China seem to indicate that no, they want an international order shaped by China. And there's some indications that maybe they just want their piece of the pie. They want their sphere of influence and can move on. What do you think is the reality, Arav?
I think obviously they do have ambitions on the regional stage, and they are going to sort of try and dominate the region. But I think they do want to be the world's superhouse in terms of manufacturing and be because I think that puts them in a really powerful position, more than just having their share of the pie. It puts them in a really powerful position, and I think they really want to be in that position. So this kind of brings to the broader question. We talk about a hot conflict in Israel, in Gaza, with a nuclear power, Russia and Ukraine. There's a possibly genocidal civil war going on in Sudan, tensions with China, which were at a peak for 4 years under Trump, have been pushed to the side because of all the other things going on. Is the world on the brink? Is the international system in chaos, or is this just kind of like a attention bias? The world is on fire, in my opinion. I think my baseline for this was 4 years ago. Okay, even the entire period from 2017 to 2021 was, I think, just a period of extraordinary peace. I think the world is just much more in a much more precarious position than it was 4 or 5 years ago. John?
Yeah, I'd agree that things are definitely worse now than they have been recently. I think I'd say I think the world has been on fire for most of human history, right? Big countries invading their neighbors, civil wars, ethnic cleansing, horrible stuff like that. That's the norm. Mm-hmm. That's human history. I think we've been privileged to live in an era since, the Second World War, where we had American global hegemony, where we had American-backed institutions, the United Nations, the development of the European Union, a lot of things that made there be peace, development, prosperity, security in the world. And the United States has withdrawn a lot. We've let a lot of things catch on fire, and we're not able to really maintain those institutions as well as we have in the past. So this is we're going back to history. Well, with that, I want to thank you both for joining us on Pod and Man at Yale. It was a great discussion. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And now to our interview with Hillsdale College's Paul Ray on American foreign policy mistakes since the Cold War. I'd like to welcome Dr. Paul Ray to the podcast. Dr. Ray holds the Charles O. Lee and Louise K. Lee Chair in Western Heritage at Hillsdale College, where he's a professor of history. He's authored numerous books on traditional Western thinkers and classical civilization. He's here in New Haven to deliver the Buckley Institute's second Donald Kagan Memorial Lecture. Welcome to Pod and Man at Yale.
It's good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So before we begin, I just want to encourage everyone to go on Buckley's YouTube channel, give Dr. Ray's lecture a listen. The talk is titled An Improvident Stewardship, American Statesmanship Since the End of the Cold War. So how did America's foreign policy change after the Soviet Union collapsed?
After the Cold War, the elder Bush, and by the way, I blame all presidents of both parties in this period, announced the inauguration of a new world political order. What was that new world political order based on? Free trade, which was also part of the Kantian package, the spread of democracy everywhere, free press, and so forth. And for 30 years, we acted, and we still continue to act to some extent, as if a utopia had been created that made war impossible. The consequence is our European allies disarmed. Who could possibly overthrow the existing order? With free trade, what you got is a situation where comparative advantage took over. And industry migrated to places with cheap labor. What's happened in the 30 years is the West has disarmed. It has lost the capacity even to build the arms. Russia has reinserted itself as a kind of imperial power. And China wants to be the central kingdom.
So I kind of have a follow-up question, because this is something, I've read about before. I'm actually reading Professor Kagan's book, The Origins of War, the Preservation of Peace now. So I did want to ask, because this was one of the counter-arguments I've always heard about the idea that commerce breeds peace, is that before World War I, there was probably the greatest level of international commerce and international traffic than at any time we know of in human history before then.
That's absolutely right. Even movement of peoples. There weren't passports.
Right.
You could go from one place to another without any great difficulty. It doesn't guarantee it. It makes it less likely. And look, the experiment of the European Union, the common market before that, the whole purpose of the thing was to get Germany and France so economically entangled with one another that it was almost unthinkable for them to go to war against one another. And it worked in that case. But think about what had to be done to Germany first,
right,
before that was possible. We're in a situation where Russia wasn't defeated the way Germany was in World War II.
Right. Interesting. I never thought about it that way.
And the consequence is when they get back on their feet economically, and they were economically devastated, they'll push back just as they always have before.
Because they never, in their minds, they've never lost.
That's right. They can blame it on communism. Well, they're not communist anymore. And of course, China has bounced back from what they call the sort of 100 years of humiliation. And China's always thought of itself as the central power, the central kingdom. And that's exactly what they're telling their people they're aiming at now. So what you've got is the makings of another world war.
So to that point, it might seem a little turn. I'm just trying to remember my, foreign policy stuff I learned in college. And I remember at the time, there were two major, theories that shaped how people looked at international relations. There was kind of the end of history version, which is what we were talking about. Eventually, all these countries will democratize. They'll become peaceful, fits and starts. Eventually, we'll have world peace that way. Then there's more the clash of civilizations approach. How do you, in that spectrum, in that venue of thinking, how do you see foreign policy of the past 30 years?
I'm not with Frank Fukuyama, and I'm not with Huntington, nor am I with the foreign policy idealists, the Wilsonians, nor am I with the realists. I'm a historian, so I take cultural differences seriously. In that regard, I have some sympathy for Huntington's position. I just think that it's kind of, as articulated, it's over the top. But look, Huntington's position, toned down, is there are civilizational differences that guarantee that there will continue to be conflict. And that Frank Fukuyama is overly naive about this. I think that's right. The architect of the last 30 years was Henry Kissinger, who successfully created a kind of European system that absorbed small wars but avoided major wars for almost 100 years. And so his game was to keep the Russians, the Americans, and the Chinese together on the same page. And I think he simply grotesquely misread the extent of Russian ambition, and even worse, the extent of Chinese ambition. Richard Nixon was a whole lot smarter than Henry Kissinger. I mean, Richard Nixon has sort of, been demonized, and he certainly did some foolish things. But if you look at his conduct of foreign policy, it was brilliant. He laid the foundation for the end of the Cold War by driving a wedge between China and Russia. More important, he understood the fact that war is not going to end. So, when Tiananmen Square took place, he said to a friend, "My God, have we created a monster?" Had American policy been guided by that insight that we may be in the process of creating a monster, we'd be much better off today.
You mentioned before Russia and what's happened to them and what happened to them at the end of the Cold War. What is Russia's interest in Ukraine? Why invade Ukraine 2014? Why do it 2021 or 2022?
There are two interests. One of them is cultural. From the perspective of Russian nationalists, Russia was founded in Kyiv. The perception is that the kind of holy origins of this great nation, and they really do have a sense of themselves as a great and holy nation, the successor state to Byzantium, to the Byzantine Empire, they look to Kyiv. So to have that outside their borders, these things have a kind of larger meaning. I'm going to draw an analogy. It's not fully apt, but Kyiv is for Russia what Jerusalem is for Jews.
I was actually going to ask about that. Yeah.
It's not as serious. Another aspect of it is if you're looking for farmland, the three places in Europe that have fabulous soil: France, Poland, and Ukraine. There's industry, or there was before these wars, and mines, other sources of wealth. But I think it's a mistake to think of the Ukraine war as simply being about Ukraine.
I was going to ask to that point, because it isn't just Ukraine, right? There was also Georgia in 2008.
Yes.
And Russia seems fairly aggressive generally. Like we talk about China being aggressive, but they're not in the same way that Russia has been in terms of hot wars and starting them and seemingly violating this, great power truce, so to speak.
Right. And look, one of the foundations of the great power truce was the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. What the Russians did in 2014 is breached that agreement. Why did they do it? They did it because they could. And they did it as a way of humiliating us and humiliating NATO. Ukraine is a stepping stone. A lot of people deny this. So the realists will say, it's all our fault. The Americans brought Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland into NATO. This was an affront to the Russians, and it made the Russians nervous that we were going to invade. Now, what are the chances of the United States invading Russia? What are the chances of Germany invading Russia? What are the chances of France invading Russia? What are the chances of Britain invading Russia? None of these countries have any interest in Russian territory. So it's nonsense. Is there any country in the world that has claims on Russian territory? There are two. Japan has a claim to some minor islands, and China has a claim to all of Siberia, which was ceded to Russia in the 19th century in one of those unequal treaties that the Chinese denounce. And all Chinese school children are taught that Siberia is rightly theirs. So there really is a threat to Russia. And by the way, I think that threat will be realized. That is to say, Charles de Gaulle used to say that by the end of the 20th century, the eastern border of Russia would be the Ural Mountains. Now, he's wrong about that. But 2050, 2075, I think it's an excellent chance of that happening. And I think, in fact, it's happening under our eyes because the population of Siberia is increasingly Chinese. The interesting thing about what has happened since 2022 is Finland has joined NATO. Sweden has given up 150 years of neutrality to join NATO. Now, what I would submit is that sort of thing doesn't happen unless they think an attack on Ukraine is preparatory to an attack on them. The European states, leave aside Germany and France, who would sell out the rest of Europe at the drop of a hat if it profited them. They really would. All of the countries east of there, except Hungary, which is a special case, are very much concerned with the Ukraine war. They see it as their war. Why would they see it as their war if Russian ambitions are limited to Donbass, Crimea, or maybe the whole of Ukraine? So there's something big going on.
From Russia's perspective, what is that bigger thing as you understand it?
The bigger thing is that they have their rightful place in the world, which is to dominate Europe. That's been their aim for a very long time. So this is completely consistent with previous Russian conduct. And what I want to point to is this. Russia's neighbors, its close neighbors, they know Russia better than we do. They have to know Russia better than we do. They've lived with them forever. So they look at this move on Ukraine and they think we're next. They're not stupid. We have the privilege of being very, very far away and of being in a position to entertain illusions concerning what the Russians want. And the realists are people who encourage those illusions. And the reason is, the realists, what realism is about is the notion that all governments are pretty much the same. They all crave maximization of power, and therefore you can predict what they will do. And they refuse to allow cultural concerns to play any role in this. I'll give you another example. We have made repeated attempts to snuggle up to Iran. Why? Well, objectively, the realists would say Iran is an American ally. Look at its neighbors. We ought to be able to make a deal with the mullahs of Iran. Now, what enables them to say such a silly thing and to follow a policy? The answer is they don't take religion seriously. If you take religion seriously, if you think that the people who run Iran are actually serious Shiite Muslims and that they will sacrifice a whole lot of material well-being to pursue their interests as Shiite Muslims, then you wouldn't be surprised that this policy is going nowhere. I could say the same thing about Israeli attempts to reach an accommodation with Hamas. Netanyahu's been criticized for being too right-wing, for being too resistant to reaching an accommodation with the Palestinians. The truth is just the opposite. This attack on Israel, they could plan this because they had people working in Israel. And Netanyahu was behind a policy of allowing a substantial number of people from Gaza to come to Israel every day to work so they could case the joint. I mean, that was his foolishness. He thought, gosh, maybe we can reach a working arrangement with Hamas. Well, there's no working arrangement with Hamas. And Why is it so difficult? They're serious Sunni Muslims, and you're on Muslim land from their perspective. We have to take these things seriously.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for that. Thank you for all of your insight, and thanks for joining Pod and Man at Yale.
Thank you very much.
That's another great episode of Pod and Man at Yale in the books. Leave a comment on our YouTube channel or on whatever podcast platform you use. And as always, for God, for country, and for Yale in that order.